Global power dynamics are changing, the world order reshaping. The risk of escalation is everywhere as further strategic and ideological confrontation looms. This is Xi Jinping's assertive new nationalism happening. Gone the bide your time deference of pre-superpower status. Welcome to China's brave new world. If you've been a little distracted by a virus that's going round, you're not the only one. But while maybe you and just about everyone else was focusing on things a little closer to home, China has been busily stoking the fires of global anxiety. This, it believes, will be China's century, and the way things are looking, Beijing's determined that no one, no country, will come in its way. China emerged from its COVID crisis and got straight to work. At home, President Xi Jinping's grip is tightening. Abroad, well, some say Mr. Xi's been overplaying his hand. Wind the clock back 50 years, and what's happening right now comes into sharp focus. Richard Nixon's gone down in history as a man who took a few disastrous gambles. But when, as a US president with untarnished anti-communist credentials, he flew into Beijing and shook hands with Mao Zedong, it shook the world. And it seemed for a while that this was a gamble worth taking. The declassified transcript of that seismic meeting in Mao's private quarters on the 21st of February 1972 reveals a conversation that ultimately brought the People's Republic of China out of the cold and into the fold, with a seat at the table in the family of nations. We can find common ground, Nixon reassured Mao, despite our differences, to build a world structure in which both can be safe to develop in our own way, on our own roads. Nixon himself described his foray to Beijing as the week that changed the world. Now, in 1 month flat, the Trump administration has undone Nixon's bold vision of that new world order. America's and China's differences now a chasm too wide to span. China's chosen road under the mighty Xi Jinping, to many a 21st century reincarnation of Mao, is deemed too repressive, too authoritarian for even Donald Trump. True, with US elections looming and his polling pretty dismal, China bashing's proved a handy distraction. But Trump's Kung Flu epithets are just jingoistic manifestations of ruptured relations. In the past 4 weeks, we've seen the US place sanctions on Chinese officials, the revocation of Hong Kong's special status, a declaration that Beijing's would-be maritime empire is completely unlawful, alleged undercover operatives arrested, and China's Houston consulate ordered to close. It was no coincidence that the chosen venue for Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's strident speech branding China a new tyranny was the Nixon Library in the disgraced late president's hometown.
If we want to have a free 21st century and not the Chinese century of which Xi Jinping dreams, the old paradigm of blind engagement with China simply won't get it done. We must not continue it, and we must not return to it.
Beijing's response was to compare Pompeo to an ant trying to shake a tree. But if this isn't just all pre-election posturing by an administration desperate to deflect focus, what has China done to rile not just the USA, but an ever-lengthening list of countries refusing to kowtow to the new superpower on the bloc? Let's start with the growing international outrage over repression on the home front. Suddenly, the long-running plight of ethnic Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim minorities in western Xinjiang province has come to international prominence. Allegations of discrimination, incarceration, torture, forced sterilization and slavery amounting to genocide have been extensively documented. There is evidence that more than 1.5 million Uyghurs are currently under mass detention in re-education camps. With global supply chains coming under ever greater scrutiny, a coalition of 180 human rights groups claims many of the world's biggest fashion brands and retailers are almost certainly complicit in these atrocities. China's the world's biggest cotton producer, and 84% of this cotton comes from Xinjiang, they say. The allegations of human rights violations against Uyghurs have been flatly denied by Beijing. What's less often cited is what's going on in Tibet, occupied and annexed by China the year after Mao's revolutionaries came to power. Under the cover of the pandemic, Beijing introduced an ethnic unity law there in May, a forced assimilation program which criminalizes separatism or any action seen as undermining the oneness of the motherland. Clunkily choreographed propaganda films depict happy monks singing China's praises as Tibetans wave the red flag. The reality is starkly different. 2 monks died in April while serving hard labour sentences. One found guilty of making a garment for the exiled Dalai Lama, the other for participating in an anti-government protest. Even those deemed to hold a stubborn or determined attitude can be jailed under the new law. This video emerged of Tibetan nuns, seemingly dressed in combat fatigues, undergoing patriotic re-education. Chinese state officials are now present in every monastery, where the red flag must be flown and portraits of Chinese Communist Party leaders displayed. It's no wonder that in Hong Kong, that other supposedly autonomous region, Beijing's new sedition law has triggered fears from the millions opposed to Chinese authoritarianism that their city, for so long a lone beacon of democratic freedom in China, will go the same way as Xinjiang and Tibet. The draconian law, again introduced as the rest of the world was focused on the pandemic, has pretty much put an end to mass protests, which convulsed the city last year. The majority of Hong Kongers now find themselves on the front line of growing global resistance to Xi Jinping's imperial nationalism. Nothing exemplifies China's imperial ambitions more than the expansion of its blue water fleet, and President Xi's bid to make China the preeminent power in the region. In the past 6 years, China has launched more warships and submarines than the UK's entire Royal Navy fleet put together. This year, China's defence budget is up nearly 7% on last year, despite the economic impact of the pandemic. Its armed forces are now the biggest in the world. It's built its first overseas naval facility in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, and intends to build a global strategic network of bases to protect its overseas interests. But where the People's Liberation Army's projection of power has triggered the greatest alarm is in its militarization of the South China Sea, amid the world's most lucrative sea lanes. It's placed cruise and surface-to-air missiles on outposts in the Spratly archipelago, where it's reclaimed land on remote coral atolls and built bases and runways. It's had punch-ups with Vietnam over the Paracel Group and confrontations with the Philippines, Malaysia and Indonesia, and warned off US and Australian freedom of navigation patrols. At the heart of China's dispute with 5 other countries is its 9-dash line, which encircles 90% of the contested waters, running as far as 2,000 kilometers from the mainland, an area over which Beijing claims indisputable sovereignty. The 9-dash line even features in all new Chinese passports. In 2016, a Hague tribunal nullified China's claims in an effort to resolve a dispute with the Philippines, ruling that China had no historical claim to the South China Sea or to the resources within it. Now, both Australia and the US have toughened their positions, asserting the claim has no legal basis, and Pompeo stating that the US will not allow Beijing to treat the South China Sea as its maritime empire. The South China Sea has long been a potential flashpoint, but if this Cold War turns hot, this is where it's likely to start. All this as China bristles with Taiwan, which it's vowed to reunify with the mainland. There have been several violent incidents along China's disputed frontier with India. China appears to be picking fights everywhere and retaliates forcefully against countries which it views as Sinophobic. Britain is bracing for Beijing's response to its offer of a bolt hole for Hong Kongers and its blacklisting Huawei. 2 Canadians are in jail, charged with espionage and apparent retaliation for the arrest of a Huawei executive. Australia hit with trade sanctions, and Beijing's warned Chinese students away. In Africa and across the Asia-Pacific, there has been a backlash to Beijing's debt-trap diplomacy, with countries finding themselves locked into generations of indebtedness over China's apparent largesse. The century of humiliation inflicted by Britain on China in the mid-19th century has a lot to do with what's going on now. Parliament dispatched the Royal Navy to defend British opium traffickers and smashed China into submission and shame. It has never been forgotten. For Beijing, the time's come to reclaim what it believes is China's rightful place in the world.